The diplomatic chamber of the Oxyrid High Command sat suspended in the upper atmosphere of a gas giant, a marvel of engineering designed to intimidate any visitor. Within its obsidian walls, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the condescending silence of the High Elders. At the center of this cold metallic cathedral stood Elias Thorne, a human delegate whose presence seemed almost offensive in its simplicity. Clad in a standard-issue United Earth suit, he looked fragile, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if the very atmosphere of the room was a burden he could barely sustain. Around his left bicep, a pulsating blue metallic band hummed with a low-frequency vibration, a gravity regulator that the Oxyrid had insisted upon to protect the human from the crushing pressure of their home world. To the Oxyrid elders, Elias was a symbol of a dying race, a representative of a species that had survived on luck rather than merit. They watched him through multifaceted eyes, their chitinous plates clicking in a rhythmic display of superiority. The High Arbiter, a towering creature with 4 translucent wings, leaned forward, its voice a grating melody of static and pride. It spoke of treaties, of resource allocation, and of the inevitable subservience of Earth to the Oxyrid hegemony. Elias remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor, his breathing shallow and rhythmic. To any observer, he was a man defeated before the negotiation had even begun, a sacrificial lamb sent to sign away the sovereignty of his people. The tension in the room was not one of conflict, but of predatory anticipation. The Oxyrid guards, armed with sonic lances, stood relaxed, their posture suggesting they viewed Elias as a mere curiosity rather than a threat. The gravity band on his arm flickered periodically, its blue light casting a sickly hue over his pale skin. No one noticed that Elias wasn't struggling with the weight of the room. He was struggling with the weight of the silence. His fingers twitched near the latch of the band, a movement so subtle it was lost in the vastness of the hall. He knew that outside this chamber, fleets were waiting for a signal that would never come, because the signal was already inside the room. Suddenly, the High Arbiter's tone shifted from condescension to an outright demand for total surrender. It was the final insult, the moment the Oxyrid believed they had finally broken the human spirit. Elias finally looked up, and for the first time, the elders saw something in his eyes that didn't align with his trembling frame. There was no fear, only a profound, ancient exhaustion. He didn't argue, he didn't plead for better terms. Instead, he reached his right hand across his chest, his fingers locking onto the cold metal of the gravity band. The hum of the device spiked into a shrill, piercing whine that echoed off the obsidian walls. The guards took a step forward, their lances humming to life, but Elias didn't flinch. He spoke for the first time, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to carry more weight than the atmosphere itself. "You spoke of weight," Elias whispered, his eyes locking onto the Arbiter. "You spoke of the burden of leadership and the crushing reality of power. But you have no concept of what it means to carry the weight of an empire within a single soul." The Oxyrids paused, confused by the cryptic nature of his words, their arrogance momentarily blinded by the sheer audacity of a human speaking back. They assumed he was having a breakdown, a final flicker of defiance before the end. With a definitive metallic click, the latch on the gravity band released. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence, a vacuum of sound where even the ventilation seemed to die. Then the band fell. It didn't just drop to the floor, it accelerated with such terrifying force that it punched through the reinforced deck plating like a kinetic slug. The sound of the impact was like a mountain collapsing, a thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the floating station. The blue light died, replaced by a suffocating violet radiance that began to bleed out from the seams of Elias's suit. The air in the chamber didn't just move, it curdled. The atmospheric sensors began to scream in a chorus of digital agony as the localized gravity plummeted and then spiked into the negatives. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks, and the holographic displays of the galaxy flickered and died, leaving the room in a state of twilight. The Oxyrid elders, once so poised, found themselves pinned to their seats by an invisible hand. The gravity in the room was no longer being managed by the station's computers. It was being dictated by the man standing in the center of the hall. Elias's body began to change, his spine straightening with a sound like snapping timber. He grew taller, his silhouette blurring as the air around him distorted in a gravitational lens. The suit he wore began to tear, not from physical growth, but from the sheer pressure of the energy radiating from his pores. The violet light intensified, turning the obsidian walls into mirrors of cosmic fire. The guards tried to raise their weapons, but their arms felt like they were made of lead. The lances fell from their numb fingers, clattering against the cracked floor. The shaking reached a crescendo, a rhythmic thrumming that felt like the heartbeat of a planet. The massive viewports, designed to withstand the pressure of a gas giant's core, began to spiderweb with cracks. Outside, the swirling clouds of the planet seemed to respond, forming a massive vortex centered directly on the diplomatic station. The human delegate was gone, replaced by a pillar of sheer, unfiltered authority. The pressure was so intense that the Oxyrid arbiter felt its exoskeleton begin to hairline fracture, its lungs struggling to pull in air that had become as heavy as water. In the center of the distortion, a figure began to coalesce. It was no longer Elias Thorne. The features were sharper, more ethereal, and possessed a terrifying majesty that transcended biology. This was a being of pure, concentrated intent, a sovereign of the stars who had been wearing a human skin like a common cloak. The alien emperor, a figure of myth and whispered legends among the oldest races of the cosmos, was manifest. He did not belong to the Oxyrid, nor to the humans, but he had chosen this moment to reveal that he had been among them all along. The Emperor's presence forced the very molecules of the room to submit. The elders were no longer sitting. They were being pressed into the floor, their bodies forced into a posture of involuntary worship. The arrogance that had defined their civilization for eons evaporated in a second, replaced by a primal, soul-crushing terror. They realized that the gravity band hadn't been a safety device for the human. It had been a seal, a dam holding back a tidal wave of celestial power that was now drowning the room in its wake. As the Emperor fully materialized, his eyes glowing with the light of 1,000 dying suns, he looked down at the broken forms of the Oxyrid. The room continued to groan, the metal screeching as the station tilted under the localized mass. The human representative was the key, the vessel, and the ultimate deception. The negotiation was over before it had begun, and as the Emperor opened his mouth to speak, the sound wasn't a voice. It was the roar of a universe being rewritten. The silence that followed the initial shock was more terrifying than the roar of the gravity shift. In the wreckage of the diplomatic chamber, the Oxyrid High Arbiter struggled to lift its head, its multi-jointed neck creaking under the unnatural weight. It looked at the figure standing where Elias Thorne once stood, and for the first time in its 300-year life, it felt the cold sting of irrelevance. The being before them was not just a king, it was a physical law. The Emperor's gaze swept across the room, and where his eyes landed, the gravity intensified, forcing the guards to crawl away in a desperate, pathetic attempt to escape the crushing aura. Outside the station, the human fleet, which the Oxyrid had dismissed as a collection of rusted scrap, began to move in perfect synchronized patterns. They weren't retreating. They were positioning themselves as a guard of honor for a master they had always known was coming. The conflict that had brewed for decades between Earth and the hegemony was suddenly revealed to be a farce. Humanity had never been fighting for survival. They had been acting as the guardians of a secret so vast it could unmake the galaxy. This realization hit the Arbiter with the force of a physical blow, a moral dilemma of cosmic proportions. To resist was suicide, but to submit was to admit their entire history was a lie. Internal alarms within the Oxyrid psyche began to clash. Their culture was built on the hierarchy of the strong over the weak, yet here was a power that made their strength look like the flickering of a candle against a supernova. The elders telepathically screamed at one another, their minds a chaotic storm of panic and tactical desperation. Should they trigger the station's self-destruct? Should they beg for mercy? The Emperor seemed to hear their unspoken thoughts, his expression one of detached, divine disappointment. He took a step forward, and the floor beneath him didn't just crack, it liquefied into molten slag. The pressure wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Every Oxyrid in the room felt their own memories being peeled back, their secrets exposed to the silent judgment of the Emperor. The social dynamics of the hegemony, built on layers of deceit and subtle power plays, crumbled instantly. The Emperor was a mirror, reflecting the ugliness of their ambition back at them. One of the younger elders, unable to bear the weight of the Emperor's presence, let out a piercing shriek and tried to lunge forward with a hidden blade. Before he could move an inch, the gravity around him spiked so sharply he was flattened into a disk of blue blood and shattered chitin. The Emperor didn't even look at the fallen elder. He spoke, and his voice resonated directly within their bone marrow. "You measured humanity by their ships and their steel," the Emperor said, the language shifting through 1,000 dialects before settling on the Oxyrid's ancient high tongue. "You ignored the spirit that housed the storm. You thought you were the masters of the void, but you are merely children playing in the shadow of a sleeping giant." The weight of his words felt like physical impacts, forcing the Arbiter to cough up dark fluid as his internal organs compressed. In the back of the chamber, a few human staff members who had accompanied Elias remained standing, though they were pale and trembling. They weren't being crushed. To them, the Emperor's presence felt like a warm, protective embrace, a stark contrast to the lethal pressure being applied to the Oxyrid. This disparity in treatment was the ultimate psychological weapon. It showed the Oxyrid that the Emperor was not a mindless force of nature, but a sentient judge who had already decided their fate. The humans looked at their former delegate with a mixture of religious awe and terrifying recognition. The moral conflict within the room reached a breaking point. The Arbiter, gasping for air, tried to reach for the emergency broadcast button on his chair, hoping to warn the rest of the hegemony. He wanted to tell them that the humans had smuggled a god into their midst, but as his finger hovered over the sensor, the Emperor simply raised a hand. The gravity in that specific cubic centimeter of space increased 1,000,000-fold. The Arbiter's finger didn't just break, it vanished into a microscopic black hole that briefly flared with Hawking radiation before evaporating, taking the control console with it. The Emperor's face softened, but it was not a look of mercy. It was the pity of a scientist looking at a failed experiment. "Your empire is built on the theft of light from others," he whispered. "You take, you consume, and you call it progress. But today, the debt is called. The human you saw was the only thing keeping the universe from looking at you directly. Without the band, there is no filter. There is only the truth." The room shook again, a deep tectonic groan that suggested the station's structural integrity was finally failing under the Emperor's mass. Outside, the Oxyrid defense platforms began to fire on the human fleet, a desperate reflex of a dying system. But the beams of plasma and coherent light didn't hit the human ships. They bent. They curved around the human vessels, as if gravity itself was shielding them, redirected by the invisible will radiating from the diplomatic chamber. The Oxyrid commanders on the ground and in the nearby ships watched their screens in horror as their most advanced weapons proved useless. The hierarchy of the galaxy was being dismantled in real time, not by a war, but by a presence. The tension within the chamber was now a physical barrier. The air was shimmering with gravitational waves, creating rainbows of distorted light that danced across the carnage. The Oxyrid elders were now weeping, a strange, rhythmic clicking sound that signaled total emotional collapse. They had spent centuries perfecting the art of the deal, the art of the threat, and the art of the conquest. None of it mattered now. They were in the presence of the Source, and the Source was displeased. The Emperor turned his gaze toward the massive viewport, looking out at the gas giant below. "This world is beautiful," he remarked, his voice hauntingly calm amidst the chaos. "It is a shame that it was claimed by those who do not understand the value of the dust it is made of." As he spoke, the storm clouds below began to part, revealing the glowing core of the planet, as if the giant itself was opening its eye to gaze upon its master. The pressure in the room became so dense that the sound of breathing was the only thing that could be heard, a wet, labored struggle for life. The chapter of Oxyrid dominance was closing, and the ink was being written in the blood of their pride. The Emperor stood at the center of the wreckage, a beacon of violet light that seemed to be expanding. He was no longer just a figure in a room. He was the center of a gravitational well that was pulling the entire solar system toward a single point of reckoning. The human who had removed the band had not just started a fight, he had ended an era. The breaking point arrived not with a bang, but with a terrifying crystalline snap. The Emperor reached out and touched the air, and the reality of the diplomatic chamber fractured. The obsidian walls didn't just break, they turned into a fine black sand that began to swirl in the air, caught in the violent gravitational eddies. The ceiling vanished, revealing the raging storms of the gas giant above, yet no wind entered the room. The Emperor's will created a pocket of absolute terrifying stillness amidst the planetary chaos. This was the Quebra, the moment where the physical world could no longer contain the magnitude of the revelation. In that instant, the High Arbiter's mind finally shattered. He saw the truth behind the Emperor's eyes. The Emperor wasn't just a leader of an alien race. He was the collective consciousness of a civilization that had transcended the physical plane eons ago, using humanity as a biological anchor to remain tethered to this dimension. The human was never a delegate. He was a living seal, a lock on a door that should never have been opened. The realization that the Oxyrid had spent decades bullying a god's chosen vessel was a psychological trauma from which no recovery was possible. The Arbiter let out a final, hollow sound before collapsing into a catatonic state. Then the supernatural truly took hold. The Emperor's form began to flicker, growing into a gargantuan projection that filled the sky above the station. He was no longer a man-sized being. He was a celestial entity, his robes woven from nebulae and his crown forged from pulsars. The Oxyrid fleet, thousands of ships strong, was suddenly caught in a temporal loop. Time around the station slowed to a crawl, then began to reverse and fast-forward in erratic bursts. Ships were seen de-aging into raw ore, then hyper-evolving into advanced husks, then blinking out of existence entirely as their timelines were pruned by the Emperor's mere presence. The human staff members fell to their knees, but not from pressure, from a sudden, overwhelming infusion of knowledge. They saw the history of the universe, the birth of stars, and the role their species was destined to play as the keepers of the king. Tears of golden light streamed down their faces as they understood the magnitude of the sacrifice Elias Thorne had made to carry that gravity band for so long. Every step he had ever taken on Earth had been an act of monumental strength, holding back a power that could ignite galaxies just so humanity could live in peace for a little while longer. The station itself began to groan as it was pulled into the Emperor's personal orbit. The metal didn't just bend, it sang. A haunting, melodic frequency vibrated through every bolt and beam, a requiem for the Oxyrid civilization. The Emperor raised both hands, and the gravity band, still sitting in the crater it had made in the floor, began to glow with a blinding white light. It wasn't just a piece of technology. It was a relic of ancient magic, a talisman that had been enchanted to hold the weight of a soul. As it glowed, the Emperor's power reached its absolute zenith. A massive shockwave of violet energy erupted from the center of the chamber. It rippled through the gas giant, flattening the storms and turning the planet's atmosphere into a solid, shimmering crystal for a brief second before it shattered into a billion diamonds. The Oxyrid homeworld, light years away, felt the tremor. Every one of their psychic resonant crystals, the basis of their technology, cracked simultaneously. The Kebra was total. The hegemony's power grid, their communication, and their very sense of self were severed in a single divine heartbeat. Amidst the destruction, a vision appeared to everyone within the station. They saw a future where the stars themselves bowed to the throne of Earth, not out of fear, but out of a cosmic recognition of the Emperor's return. They saw the Oxyrid as servants, their warlike nature purged by the sheer awe of what they had witnessed. The vision was so intense, it felt like a physical weight, a prophecy being burned into the collective consciousness of the galaxy. There would be no more war, for there was no longer anyone left with the courage to raise a hand against the light. The Emperor then turned his gaze back to the ruined chamber. With a flick of his wrist, the catatonic arbiter was lifted into the air. The creature's eyes bulged as the Emperor spoke a single word of power that didn't travel through the air, but through the soul. The word was witness. In that moment, the arbiter was granted the ability to see every dimension at once, the past, the present, and the infinite possibilities of the future. The weight of this gift was too much for a mortal mind. The arbiter's eyes turned to liquid gold, and he became a living statue, a permanent monument to the day the human removed the band. The gravity in the room suddenly inverted. Everything that wasn't anchored, debris, broken weapons, the bodies of the guards, was flung upward into the open sky, disappearing into the vortex above. The Emperor stood alone in the center of a circular platform, the only part of the station that remained intact. He looked down at his hands, which were now shimmering with the same violet fire. The human shell of Elias Thorne was gone, burned away by the radiance of the true king. The transition was complete. The Emperor was no longer hidden. He was the sun around which all things would now revolve. Suddenly, the screaming alarms of the station fell silent. The temporal distortions stabilized. The galaxy seemed to hold its breath. The Kebra had reached its conclusion, leaving behind a world that was fundamentally different from the one that had existed 10 minutes prior. The balance of power hadn't just shifted, it had been deleted. There was no more hegemony. There was no more human federation. There was only the Emperor and his subjects. The Emperor looked at the surviving humans, his expression now one of profound, fatherly love. "You carried me in the dark," he said, his voice a soothing melody that healed their broken minds and bodies. "Now you shall walk with me in the light." He stepped off the edge of the platform, walking on the empty air, as if it were a paved road, heading toward the waiting human fleet. Each step he took sent ripples of golden light through the vacuum of space, visible for parsecs in every direction. The chapter ended with the total collapse of the Oxyrid station. As the Emperor reached the lead human ship, the diplomatic station simply folded in on itself, vanishing into a singularity that left no trace of its existence. The gas giant below began to glow with a new inner light, transforming from a chaotic storm world into a serene, luminous star. The universe had been broken, and in its place, something far more terrifying and beautiful was beginning to grow. The aftermath of the Emperor's revelation was a tide of transformation that swept through the galaxy like a wildfire. On Earth, the news did not arrive via screens or radio, but through a simultaneous planet-wide psychic awakening. Every man, woman, and child felt the moment the gravity band was removed. a sudden lightness in their chests, a feeling of ancient chains falling away. The collective trauma of being a lesser species evaporated, replaced by a terrifying sense of responsibility. They were no longer the orphans of the stars. They were the descendants of the divine, the chosen harbor for a power that had now reclaimed its throne. Social structures on Earth began to pivot overnight. Governments that had spent decades preparing for a war of extinction found their military budgets and strategic plans rendered obsolete. What use were nuclear silos and orbital lasers when their emissary could collapse a star system with a gesture? A deep, reflective silence settled over the cities. People walked the streets with a new gait, their eyes reflecting a hint of that violet light. The transformation was internal. The human psyche was being recalibrated to handle the proximity of a god. Religion, science, and philosophy merged into a single desperate attempt to understand their new reality. In the Oxyrid territories, the consequences were far more devastating. Their entire society was built on the will of the strong, and that will had been utterly crushed. The survivors of the diplomatic incident, those few who hadn't been turned to dust or gold, returned home as broken prophets. They spoke of the human who was a king, and their words acted like a virus, dismantling the hegemony's rigid caste system. Riots didn't break out. Instead, a massive planet-wide wave of surrenders occurred. Entire fleets powered down their engines and waited for judgment, the Oxyrid warriors dropping their weapons in a gesture of total, ego-stripping submission. The physical impact on the galaxy was equally profound. The gravity of the sector where the Emperor appeared had been permanently altered. New trade routes had to be mapped because space-time itself had become thicker near the human territories. Objects moved differently. Light behaved with a strange, sentient logic. Scientists discovered that the laws of physics were no longer static. They seemed to respond to the Emperor's mood. When the Emperor was displeased, the stars in the nearby clusters dimmed. When he was at peace, the nebulae glowed with colors never before seen by organic eyes. The relationship between the humans and the Emperor was the most complex consequence of all. He was their savior, but he was also a reminder of their own insignificance. He walked among them on the lead ship of the fleet, now renamed the Sovereign's Rest, but he was no longer Elias Thorne. Those who had known Elias felt a deep, mourning grief for the man who had been consumed by the god. They missed his laughter, his clumsiness, and his human flaws. The Emperor was perfect, and perfection is a cold thing to love. This emotional rupture created a new kind of melancholy in the human heart, a longing for the mask that had been their friend. Interstellar politics became a series of pilgrimages. Alien races from across the quadrants, some who hadn't made contact with anyone in millennia, emerged from the shadows to offer gifts to the Emperor. They didn't come to negotiate, they came to be seen. The diplomatic chamber on the Sovereign's Rest was always full of kneeling beings, a mosaic of scales, fur and energy, all waiting for a single glance from the violet-eyed sovereign. The dynamic of the galaxy had shifted from a competitive arena to a centralized court, where the only currency that mattered was the Emperor's favor. The Emperor himself seemed to be managing the consequences with a terrifying efficiency. He didn't issue decrees or pass laws. He simply existed, and his presence acted as a moral compass. Crime rates on human colonies plummeted because it was impossible to hide a dark intent from the one who could see through time. The psychological pressure of being constantly watched by a divine entity led to a new era of radical honesty and transparency, but it also robbed humanity of its privacy. The cost of being the king's people was the loss of the shadows where human nature usually hides. As the weeks passed, the physical changes in the humans became more apparent. Their lifespans began to extend, their bodies healing from diseases that had plagued them for centuries. The Emperor's radiance was terraforming them from within, preparing their biology for a future they couldn't yet imagine. They were becoming more than human, but at the cost of their autonomy. They were the Emperor's children, but children have no say in the Father's house. This tension, the gratitude for the healing and the fear of the loss of self, became the new conflict of the era. The Oxyrid High Arbiter, still a golden statue in the ruins of the station, became a site of religious pilgrimage. Even as the station was rebuilt by human engineers, the statue remained immovable, a localized anomaly that no machine could shift. It served as a constant reminder of the Quebra. The Oxyrid would visit it to touch the golden surface, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infinite that had broken their leader. They were a race looking for a new purpose, and they found it in the service of the one who had humbled them. The Emperor's fleet eventually reached Earth's orbit. The day the Sovereign's Rest appeared in the sky, the moon seemed to glow brighter, caught in the Emperor's gravitational wake. The world held its breath. This was the return of the king to his ancestral home, but the home felt too small for him. The consequences of his presence were outgrowing the planet, outgrowing the system. The galaxy was no longer a collection of warring states. It was becoming a single organism, with the Emperor as its heart and humanity as its blood. But deep within the halls of power on Earth, a small group of dissidents remained. They were the ones who remembered the Elias Thorne who liked coffee and feared heights. They were the ones who saw the Emperor not as a god, but as a colonizer of the human soul. They were the last remnants of the old humanity, and they watched the violet light in the sky with a mixture of awe and resentment. To them, the removal of the gravity band wasn't a liberation. It was the beginning of the end of human history. The chapter closed with the Emperor descending toward the surface of the Earth, not in a ship, but as a falling star that slowed and landed gently in the center of the United Nations Plaza. As he touched the ground, the grass turned to silver and the fountains flowed with wine. The transformation of the world was entering its final phase. The consequences were clear. The universe had been saved from its own petty wars, but it had been traded for a golden cage of divine order. The final resolution began in the heart of the United Nations, where the Emperor stood before the assembled leaders of every nation and every planet. The air was charged with a finality that felt like the end of a long, exhausting journey. The Emperor did not sit on a throne. He stood in the center of the circle, his violet eyes dimmed to a soft, approachable lavender. He looked at the faces of the humans, those who worshipped him, those who feared him, and the few who still mourned the man he had replaced. The time for displays of power was over. The time for the truth had come. "I did not come to be your master," the Emperor's voice echoed, sounding more like Elias Thorne than ever before. "I came because the universe was tilting toward a darkness you could not see." The Oxyrid were but a symptom of a deeper decay, a coldness that would have eventually snuffed out all life. He reached into the air and pulled out a small, burnt fragment of the gravity band, the only piece that had survived the destruction. He held it out for all to see, a tiny, insignificant piece of metal that had once held back the tide of eternity. He explained that the humanity he had inhabited was not a cage, but a teacher. Through Elias Thorne, the Emperor had learned what it meant to be small, to be afraid, and to love in the face of certain death. He had learned the value of the weight. The gravity band wasn't just to protect the Oxyrid, it was to keep the Emperor grounded in the human experience. Without the weight of mortality, a god becomes a monster of pure logic. The resolution he offered was not one of eternal rule, but of a final parting gift. The Emperor began to glow one last time, but it wasn't the violent, crushing light of the diplomatic chamber. It was a soft, white radiance that felt like the first sun of spring. He began to dissolve, his essence expanding not outward to conquer, but inward into the very fabric of the human spirit. He was not leaving, he was integrating. He was giving back the power he had manifested, distributing it among all people so that no one being, human or alien, would ever have to carry the weight of an empire alone again. As he faded, the localized gravity anomalies around the Earth and the Oxyrid systems stabilized. The violet light in the sky softened into a permanent, beautiful aurora that would be visible from every planet in the galaxy, a reminder of the day the king appeared. The Oxyrid High Arbiter, the golden statue, finally crumbled into a fine mist, releasing the consciousness of the leader who woke up with a mind healed and a heart full of humility. The Quebra was resolved not by a final blow, but by a final embrace. The humans felt the change instantly. The divine power they had feared was now a subtle hum in their own veins. They were still human, but they were more. They had the clarity of the Emperor and the empathy of Elias. The dissidents who had feared the loss of their soul found that their humanity had actually been expanded. The Emperor had not stolen their history. He had finished the first volume and given them a blank book for the second. The balance of the universe was rewritten not through dominance, but through the ultimate act of abdication. In the ruins of the Oxyrid hegemony, a new council was formed, one led by both humans and the former elders. They worked together to rebuild, not out of fear, but out of a shared vision that had been burned into their minds during the Quebra. The technology of the Oxyrid was combined with the newfound Emperor's spark in the humans, leading to an era of medical and scientific breakthroughs that made the previous age look like the Stone Ages. The galaxy was finally at peace, a peace bought with the removal of a single metallic band. The final scene of this cosmic drama took place in a small park in New York City, near where the Emperor had first landed. A young woman, who had been a close friend of the real Elias Thorne, sat on a bench, looking up at the lavender aurora. She felt a presence beside her, not a god, not a king, but a familiar warmth. She turned, and for a fleeting second she saw the ghost of a man with hunched shoulders and a kind, tired smile. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, a final thank you for the weight she had helped him carry. The ghost vanished, leaving behind only the scent of old books and coffee. The human was truly gone. But his legacy was the survival of everything he had loved. The gravity of the world felt right again, not too heavy, not too light, but exactly what was needed to keep one's feet on the ground while looking at the stars. The Emperor had returned to the void, leaving behind a galaxy that was finally ready to govern itself. The story of the human who removed the gravity band became the founding myth of the new galactic civilization. It was taught to every child that power is a burden to be shared and that the greatest strength lies in the courage to be weak. The diplomatic chamber where it all began was left as a void in space, a protected sanctuary where no one was allowed to enter, a reminder of the moment when the air buckled and the floor cracked and the universe changed forever. The resolution was not a victory of one race over another, but a victory of the spirit over the machine. The Oxyrid, the humans, and the thousands of other species were now linked by a common thread of violet light. They were the Emperor's children, but they were also the Elias's heirs. They moved forward into the unknown, no longer afraid of the dark, for they knew that the greatest power in the universe had once worn a human suit and walked among them as a friend. And so the galaxy settled into its new rhythm. The alarms stopped screaming, the consoles stopped flickering, and the shaking of the room subsided into the steady, peaceful hum of a universe in balance. The human had removed the band, the Emperor had appeared, and in doing so they had both ensured that neither would ever be needed again. The story ended where it began, with a single, quiet breath in a world that was finally truly free.